He was a world-famous writer, about to receive millions for his next book. But one mistake, one gate left open, cost him his little boy's life. Broken, drowning in guilt, and abandoned by love, he escaped to a lonely house by the ocean. There, a mysterious girl appeared, too real to be a dream, too impossible to be alive. What followed wasn't just a haunting. It was the beginning of a truth that would shatter his world forever. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. He had everything the world thought mattered. Fame that made waiters whisper, fortune that turned invitations into obligations, a name, Marcus Hale, that appeared in embossed silver on publisher letters and in gold on bestseller lists. In a week, he would sign the papers for his largest advance yet. For €1,000,000 for a novel the critics hadn't even read and already adored. But on that morning, the numbers and the noise lived on the far side of the study door. Inside, the only thing that existed was ink, paper, and a man bargaining with a blank page the way a drowning man bargains with a storm. He wrote with a fountain pen that hissed very softly, the sound like a match being struck over and over. The desk was old oak, scarred by other books and other lives, and the window above it was open just enough to let the smell of the canal drift in. Water and weeds and the faintest memory of salt from a sea that lived in his imagination more than on any map. Wind nudged the sheer curtain. The house was quiet. The quiet held. Clara broke it. Not with a bang or a sob. Clara never gave anyone the satisfaction of open grief, but with the cool, surgical click of the door and a single envelope in her hand. She was tall, elegant, a woman whose sentences could straighten a crooked manuscript in 13 words or less. Editors loved her as a scalpel. Publishers ignored her as a heart. The envelope was thin, white, and heavy with the familiar weight of humiliation. "They said no," she murmured. The letter landed on his desk like a moth, and somehow it still felt too loud. Again. She laughed without humor. "They called it assured. Clever. Technically immaculate," she recited, mouth tightening around the phrase as if it tasted of metal. "But they don't want immaculate. They want Marcus Hale." He set the pen down, turned the pages of his notebook over like a quilt on a sleeping body, and faced her. "They're wrong," he said gently. "They were wrong last time. They'll be wrong next time. Keep sending it. Clara, it's good. Good." She paced to the window, framed in the curtain's pale motion. "When they say good to me, it's a condolence card." She looked back, and her eyes were restless, searching his face as if there might be a hidden apology there, or a confession. "You don't even need to try anymore," she whispered. "Not like I do." He could have told her 100 unglamorous truths, about the mornings he woke hollow, about the chapters that fought him like wild animals, about the draft he'd burned in a metal bowl once at 3 a.m. because it would not be born. But the doorframe filled with sunlight and a boy, and truth no longer mattered. Daniel stepped into the study with a toy knight in one hand and a gravity in his small face that both broke and built Marcus in the same instant. 3 minutes, Daniel declared, holding up fingers sticky with apple juice and adventure. 3 minutes and then you come outside. I made a fort. The knight says it's very urgent. 3 minutes, Marcus swore, touching 2 fingers to his chest like a soldier taking an oath. Daniel's smile was so bright it felt like the house got a new window. Then he was gone, the patter of his steps skipping toward the back hall, toward the garden, toward the day that waited like a golden dog on the porch. Clara stood very still. The envelope lay on the desk like a fallen feather from some cruel angel. Marcus reached for her hand. She let him take it but did not let him keep it. "Lunch," he said softly, a truce disguised as a plan. "We'll eat on the terrace. Sunshine is still free." The kitchen was kinder than the study. Garlic obeyed him. He measured olive oil and thyme, coaxed onions until they turned translucent enough to confess their sweetness, and salted water with the precision of a man who wanted one thing, anything, to turn out exactly right. He boiled pasta, tossed it with cherry tomatoes and basil, shaved a snowfall of cheese over the top, and breathed in the peace it pretended to offer. He called them. Clara? The house did not answer. Daniel? He tried to make it sing-song, playful. The echo came back clean and empty. He checked the dining room, the hall, the little alcove where Daniel liked to hide his dinosaurs between the spines of books. Knight? He teased. Sir Knight? Your king requests. Silence laid a cool hand on his throat. He went to the terrace with the dish towel still in his fingers. The garden stretched out in a patient green sigh. Sun freckled the path of brick that led down to the canal, where water held the sky like a mirror that preferred clouds to faces. The gate in the iron railing was not only unlatched. It was ajar, tapping against the post as if making a small, polite complaint to the wind. The first thought was as practical as a paring knife. I didn't close it. The second thought was a scream that did not yet have a mouth. Daniel? He called, already moving, already running. Danny! The sound of his shoes on the path was not fast enough. Daniel! There are names that are also prayers, and there are prayers that are only names repeated as if repetition could rewind the world. A scrap of light on the water. He saw it without seeing it. Varnished wood, small as a loaf of bread, turning and turning. The toy knight. He stumbled on the last step, caught the post with his palm, felt the rough bite of rust. The boat tied to the dock was modest, nothing more than boards and rope and afternoons. He shoved it aside so hard it banged the pilings. Beneath, pale, hair like a spill of corn silk, shirt a bloom of color drowning into blue. For a second, everything in Marcus turned to glass and then shattered at once. He threw himself into the canal. The water's cold was a theft. He grabbed the shirt, the small shoulder, the weight too wrong, and hauled the boy up and onto the dock. And the sun was suddenly too hot for a world that had just become winter. Breathe! He gasped through his own lungs burning. Breathe, baby. He pressed his mouth to the small mouth, counted compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Begged the stubborn air to remember how to be a miracle. The night watched from the water, turning and turning. Somewhere a bee argued with a flower. Somewhere, not here, life went on. He screamed for help. The neighbor's dog barked. No one came quickly enough because there is no speed that can outrun what had already happened minutes ago. When the gate was ajar and the boy with the toy followed curiosity like a string into the bright, indifferent canal. Clara's footsteps finally hammered the bricks. She arrived with a face that had never learned how to look at this. She dropped to her knees and made a sound that did not belong to language. Sirens. Blue lights that could not reanimate a world. Hands, questions, the choreography of too late. A blanket with corners the color of emergency. A paramedic's eyes once. Apologizing with a profession that trains you to deliver formal sorrow while counting your own heartbeats. The study was still open when he staggered back in long after the sirens had done their work and the neighbors had turned into silhouettes whispering on sidewalks. The pen lay where he'd left it. The sentence half-born looked up at him with awful innocence. He closed the notebook as if tucking in a child who had already gone to sleep in another, safer story. Then he closed the study door, and then he closed something else that had no hinges and no key. Days turned into fragments. Time forgot its grammar. He cooked because chopping made sense when nothing else did. He did not eat because chewing didn't. The house developed a faithful neverness, a pane of glass between each room and meaning. He folded Daniel's shirts with a care that bordered on reverence, not because he believed in any god that asked for folded shirts, but because the ritual scissored minutes into something he could count. Clara moved through grief as if it were a corridor with many doors, and she had decided to open none of them. She worked late, or said she did. She watched him as if trying to catch him faking something that he could only fail, because there is no honest way to survive your child. Her manuscript lay untouched on the console table for days, or weeks, or one lifetime. He walked by the canal every afternoon the way men return to crime scenes, not to confess but to understand what refuses to be understood. He latched the gate each time with the furious tenderness of someone attempting to repair the past by disciplining the present. He began to talk to Daniel there the way you talk to wind. Some days, the wind answered with a small sound like a toy tapping a hull. On the 12th evening, he called it 12th because numbers felt more obedient than feelings, his friend Theo came. Theo looked like the kind of man who could fix a broken chair with twine and good intentions. He couldn't fix this. He sat at Marcus's table and drank the coffee that had boiled 1 minute too long. "You can't write here," Theo said softly. "Every room is a bruise. Take a month. Take 3. Go somewhere that isn't this. There's a cottage I know, at the end of a road that forgets itself. Ocean at its feet. Air that tastes like beginning." "I can't leave him," Marcus said, before realizing that he meant the ghost of a boy, the weightless weight that followed him from the laundry room to the study to the gate to the smallest hour. "You won't," Theo said. "He's in you, but you can leave the water." He glanced at the canal as if it were a person who might overhear them and take offense. That night, sleep came the way mercy sometimes does. Late, and only because it was too tired to stay away. In the blue hour, before morning decides what to be, Marcus dreamed Daniel was at the foot of the bed. Not a horror movie child or an angel. Just a boy with damp hair and a toy he wanted to show his father. "It's time," Daniel whispered. "Write me a different ending." Marcus woke against a wet pillow. He booked the cottage before he could think himself out of it. He packed a suitcase and then packed another from rooms that had become museums of smallness. A sock with a rocket ship on it, the night, he dried it carefully as if rust were a sin. A book with a torn page because Daniel had turned it too quickly to see what happened to the elephant. He placed them in a canvas bag as if he might one day need a passport to pass between lives, and these were the documents that proved he'd loved. On the morning he left, the house was as quiet as it had been on the morning he had everything. The difference was inside the silence, a geometry changed by the absence it now held. Clara did not come down to say goodbye. Perhaps she was sleeping. Perhaps she had learned to dream through alarms. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, as if the wood might be able to remember him better than the world had remembered anyone. At the gate he paused, latched it, checked the latch, and then checked it again, as if the past were a dog that could be kept from running into the road if only the gate were good and the hinge well-oiled and the man careful enough. When he turned away, the canal showed him his own face briefly, bent by ripples into a stranger's. He drove toward a road that didn't ask him questions. The city thinned into fields, and the fields dissolved into a horizon that smelled like salt and kelp and a promise no human had authority to make. Somewhere ahead was a cottage at the end of a forgetting. Somewhere behind was a sentence he would never finish. He did not see the girl by the ocean that day, but the ocean did. And in the way that water knows what will be asked of it before the shore does, it kept the secret, folding it into waves that moved like the breath of something that had watched 1,000 beginnings and would watch 1,000 more. The road to the coast felt longer than any journey he had taken, though miles were nothing to a man who had traveled the world for book tours and interviews. This drive was different. Each kilometer stretched like a confession he wasn't ready to make. He drove with both hands tight on the wheel, the canvas bag with Daniel's toys resting on the seat beside him like a fragile passenger. From time to time he glanced at it, half expecting the wooden knight to lift its head and demand a new story. When at last the sea appeared, it startled him. It wasn't the gentle blue painted on postcards. It was immense, gray-green, restless. Waves rolled in heavy shoulders, crashing against black rocks that stood like old guardians at the edge of the land. The cottage Theo had spoken of stood on a cliff that sloped down into wild grass and dunes, as if it had been set there by accident and then forgotten by the world. Inside, the air smelled of pine wood and salt. There were 2 rooms, a fireplace, and windows that framed the ocean so completely it felt as though the house floated on the water itself. Marcus set his suitcase down, then the canvas bag. He opened it carefully, taking out Daniel's toys one by one, placing them on the mantel like relics in a chapel. The knight, the book with the torn page, the little shoe with a rocket embroidered on the side. He stood staring at them until his throat burned. Nights came differently here, not with city lights or the hum of traffic, but with silence so deep it pressed against his chest. He lit the fireplace and sat in its glow, trying to write. Words came, but not the ones he wanted. Pages filled with fragments of conversations he'd had with Daniel, descriptions of a toy left on a table, half-remembered dreams where the boy whispered something Marcus could never hear clearly. Every attempt at fiction turned into a letter to the dead. He would write until his eyes blurred, then crumple the pages and feed them to the fire. The first time he thought he saw Daniel was at dawn. The window faced the sea, and in the pale light he glimpsed a small figure standing at the edge of the dunes, hair tousled by the wind, holding what looked like the toy knight. Marcus rushed outside, barefoot, his heart hammering so hard it felt as though his ribs would break. But when he reached the spot, there was nothing, only footprints that faded into the sand. He dropped to his knees, scooping the sand in his hands as if it might reveal something solid. The waves kept coming, erasing. Days passed. He tried to build routines, cooking, walking the cliffs, forcing himself to write for at least an hour each morning. Yet always he returned to the sea, scanning the horizon, listening for a voice. And sometimes, when the wind carried a certain pitch, he swore he heard laughter, light, childish, gone as quickly as it arrived. He wondered if grief itself had teeth, chewing through the mind until you mistook echoes for ghosts. It was during one of those walks along the cliffs that he saw her. A woman on horseback, riding with a grace that looked almost out of place against the rawness of the sea. Her hair was dark and heavy, streaming behind her like a banner, and she wore a plain gray coat that flapped with the rhythm of the horse. She didn't notice him at first. Only when she slowed near the path and pulled the reins did her gaze lift. Her eyes were striking, large, shadowed, filled with something he recognized at once. Loneliness. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying strangely clear over the surf. He nodded, unsure whether to smile. He hadn't spoken to anyone outside of brief trips to the village store. His words felt clumsy from disuse. "Morning." She studied him, tilting her head as though she sensed something beneath his silence. Then she gestured to the sea. "It's always loud, isn't it? Like it wants to tell you secrets you're not ready to hear." The remark startled him. It was the sort of thing Daniel used to say, simple words that made the world feel deeper. He swallowed hard. "Yes," he admitted. "That's exactly it." They talked for only a few minutes. She introduced herself as Alara, a name that sounded borrowed from an old story. She lived not far, she said, in a house tucked behind the pines. He didn't press her with questions. Instead, he found himself memorizing the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, as if some shadow lived there permanently. That evening he cooked again. Rosemary bread, a stew that simmered slowly, half hoping, absurdly, that someone would join him. When he sat down alone, the toys on the mantel watched like silent judges. He pushed the bowl away untouched. The next day, Alara appeared again, this time walking along the beach, her boots leaving sharp prints in the wet sand. He found himself walking beside her, their conversation starting awkwardly but soon flowing with surprising ease. She told him she loved cooking but hated eating alone. He admitted he hadn't shared a meal with anyone since his son died. She didn't recoil at the confession. Instead, she said softly, "Then maybe we should cook together." And so they did. She came to the cottage that evening, bringing fresh herbs from her garden. Together they prepared fish, bread, and a tart made of blackberries she'd gathered that morning. It was the first time Marcus had laughed in months, at her clumsy way of kneading dough, at his own poor attempt to slice onions without tears. For a few hours, grief loosened its grip. But when night came and the house was quiet, he heard it again, the sound of small footsteps on the floorboards. He rushed into the living room, empty. The toys on the mantel had been shifted. The knight stood upright now, sword raised. His hands shook as he set it back. Maybe he had done it earlier and forgotten. Maybe. Alara noticed his restlessness the following day as they rode along the cliffs. "You keep looking over your shoulder," she said, "as if someone is following you." He hesitated, then told her. About Daniel. About the gate. About the laughter he sometimes heard in the wind. Her expression didn't change to pity or disbelief, as others had. She only whispered, "Perhaps he hasn't left you yet." The words should have comforted him. Instead, they left a weight in his chest, a question too heavy to hold. Was his son still there, or was grief dressing itself in illusions? That night, when he lay awake listening to the ocean pound against the cliffs, Marcus realized something terrifying. He wasn't afraid of the footsteps, or the laughter, or even the toys moving on their own. He was afraid of the day they might stop. The days along the coast blurred together, stitched by the rhythm of waves and the quiet company of Alara. She seemed to appear whenever his solitude pressed too heavily on him. Riding down the cliff path on her horse, standing in the market with a basket of herbs, or simply knocking at his door with a smile that asked no permission. She never explained why she lived so alone, why the village people never mentioned her, why no one seemed to know her well. And Marcus, hungry for warmth, never pressed too deeply. It was enough that she was there, alive in a place where everything else felt like ghosts. It was the old couple down the road who reminded him what community meant. Joseph and Marin, married for nearly 50 years, lived in a weathered stone house with geraniums blooming red against the gray. They treated Marcus with a gentle kindness, bringing him bread, teaching him which roads flooded in storms, inviting him to sit by their fire on evenings when the wind howled through the village. It was Marin's birthday that was approaching, and Joseph insisted he come. "Bring a friend if you like," Joseph had said, eyes twinkling. "The house will be full of music. Everyone should have someone beside them on nights like that." So Marcus asked Alara. They were walking the beach when he mentioned it, the tide dragging long ribbons of foam across the sand. She had paused, as though startled, then smiled faintly. "A birthday? That sounds lovely." Her voice carried a softness that made him think she hadn't been invited to anything in years. "I'll come." That night, Marcus wrote for the first time without fire consuming the pages. The words carried an echo of laughter, a rhythm of shared meals and quiet rides. He closed his notebook with something dangerously close to hope. The evening of the celebration arrived with lanterns strung along Joseph's porch, casting a golden glow against the sea-dark sky. Inside, the room hummed with warmth, neighbors with plates of food, Marin blushing under the attention, Joseph's booming laugh filling every corner. Marcus felt awkward at first, standing with a glass in hand, scanning the door for Alara's arrival. He pictured her walking in, gray coat brushed of sea salt, hair damp from the wind, and imagined introducing her, proud to have her by his side. An hour passed, then two. The food dwindled, the music grew louder, but Alara did not appear. Marcus's smile stiffened. He excused himself from a conversation with Joseph and slipped outside, checking the path lit faintly by the moon. Nothing. When he returned, Joseph caught his anxious glance. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked kindly. "Yes," Marcus admitted. "Alara. She said she would come." The laughter around them dimmed. A hush fell over the circle of neighbors. Marin set down her cup slowly, her expression tightening into something between sorrow and fear. Joseph's face paled. "Alara?" he repeated, voice low, as if uttering a forbidden word. Marcus frowned. "Yes, the woman who lives near the cliffs. Dark hair, rides a horse." "She." "Marcus?" Marin interrupted gently, her hand trembling as it touched his arm. "Alara doesn't live there anymore. She hasn't for years." Confusion tangled in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I see her nearly every day. We've cooked together, walked the beach. She's real." She died," Joseph said firmly, though his eyes glistened. 7 years ago. It was a terrible tragedy. She found her husband with another woman. There was a fight. The woman fell. And afterward," he hesitated, looking at the floor. "Alara poisoned him. Then she threw herself from the cliffs." The words struck Marcus like stones. He shook his head violently. No, that's impossible. She was at my cottage 2 nights ago. She brought herbs, she laughed. I touched her hand. She can't be dead." The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering, others avoiding his eyes. To them, his protests sounded like madness. To him, they sounded like the only truth he had left. He staggered from the party, the lantern light swinging madly as if mocking him. Outside, the sea roared, a relentless witness. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed Theo. His voice broke as soon as the line connected. "She's here, Theo. She's real. But they say she died 7 years ago. Tell me I'm not losing my mind." Theo's voice was calm, too calm. "Stay there. I'll come. Don't do anything foolish. We'll figure it out together." But when Marcus ended the call and looked back toward the cliffs, he thought he saw her. Alara, standing in the distance, her coat whipping in the wind, her gaze fixed on him with sorrow too deep for the living. And then, like a mirage, she was gone. Theo arrived the next afternoon, his car crunching on the gravel road like an anchor being dragged across stone. Marcus stood outside the cottage waiting, his hands trembling though he tried to hold them still. He had barely slept, pacing the floors, replaying Joseph and Marin's words again and again until they sounded like a curse. Alara was dead, but he had touched her, spoken with her, cooked beside her. Either the village was wrong, or he was unraveling. Theo stepped out, solid and calm as ever, his presence a tether to the world Marcus feared he was losing. "You sound worse than I've ever heard you," he said, pulling Marcus into a rough embrace. "Let's sort this out." Marcus's words tumbled, frantic, as he led Theo inside. "She was here, Theo, in this very room. She chopped onions, she laughed, she moved the toys. How can she be dead?" He gestured toward the mantel where the wooden knight still stood guard, as though it might defend his sanity. Theo listened carefully, nodding, his expression unreadable. "Show me where she lives," he said at last. They walked together along the narrow path through pines until the trees opened onto a clearing where a weathered house leaned against the wind. Its shutters were closed, paint flaking, roof sagging as if it had not known life in years. Marcus froze. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible. She told me she lived here." The front door stood slightly ajar. Against every instinct, Marcus pushed it open. The air inside was thick, stale, heavy with dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners. A single chair lay toppled as if in haste. The house was empty, dead empty. Marcus turned to Theo, panic rising. She was here. She was real. Theo placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Calm down. Grief does strange things. You've been alone too long. Maybe you imagined more than was there." Before Marcus could answer, a sound rippled through the silence. Footsteps on the wooden floor above. Both men looked up. The staircase creaked. And then she appeared. Alara, her dark hair loose, her coat the same gray he had seen whipping in the wind. Her eyes locked on Marcus with unbearable intensity. "Marcus," she whispered. The sound was real. Too real. Theo swore under his breath. He took a step back. But before Marcus could move, Alara darted forward, her hand gripping a kitchen knife that glimmered in the dim light. She lunged not at Marcus, but at Theo. The blade struck deep. Theo gasped, staggered, and collapsed against the wall, crimson blooming across his shirt. Marcus screamed, rushing toward him, but Alara vanished into the shadows as quickly as she had appeared, leaving only the echo of her breath. Theo's bloodied hand clutched Marcus's arm. His lips moved, but no words came, only a guttural sound that chilled Marcus to the bone. Marcus pressed his hands over the wound, desperate, terrified. "Stay with me, Theo. Please." But Theo's eyes rolled back, and his body sagged heavily against him. Marcus stumbled out of the house, half carrying, half dragging his friend until he collapsed in the grass outside. He shouted for help, but the cliffs gave him only wind in reply. Hours later, when he staggered into Joseph and Marin's home, raving about what he had seen, they listened with pity, not belief. "There's no one in that house," Joseph said firmly. "It's been empty since she died." "No!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking. "She was there. She killed him. I saw it." Marin's eyes softened with sorrow. "Marcus, are you sure you didn't imagine it? Sometimes grief creates what we need most or what we fear most." He sank into a chair, clutching his head, the world spinning. But deep down, a seed of dread began to grow. What if they were right? What if his mind had betrayed him? What if Theo's blood on his hands was nothing more than madness given form? That night, unable to sleep, Marcus searched old newspapers in the village library. He found the story. Alara, her husband, the mistress, the poison, the cliffs. Every detail Joseph had told him was there in black and white. But no photographs accompanied the article. No images at all. As if her face had been erased from history. When he stumbled back to the cottage at dawn, exhausted and hollow, Clara was waiting. She stood at the door, composed and cold, her eyes scanning him like a surgeon inspecting a wound. "You look terrible," she said quietly. "I told you leaving would make you worse." He stared at her, words trapped in his throat. How had she come here? Why now? Behind her, a figure emerged from the trees. Theo, alive, whole, no blood on his shirt. Marcus staggered back, the world tilting. His voice came out broken. "But you died." Theo's smile was wrong. Too smooth. "No, old friend. You just thought I did." And in that moment, Marcus understood. If madness hadn't already claimed him, it was waiting at the door. The room tilted around him, shadows bending into grotesque shapes. Marcus stood frozen at the threshold of his own cottage, staring at Clara and Theo as if they were strangers wearing familiar faces. Clara's eyes gleamed with a satisfaction he hadn't seen before, and Theo's smile carried none of the warmth of the friend who had once rescued him from grief. "You've been seeing her, haven't you?" Clara said softly, stepping closer. Her voice was calm, too calm, like a blade hidden in silk. "The girl with the gray coat. The one who doesn't exist." Marcus shook his head violently. "She exists. I cooked with her. I walked with her. She—" "Marcus," Theo interrupted, voice dripping with false pity. "Think about it. Everyone in the village told you she's dead. No photos, no records. Just a story. Don't you see? You've been slipping for months. The guilt, the isolation, it's finally broken you." He backed away, his heart hammering. "No, you set this up. You!" Clara's laughter was quiet, poisonous. "Finally, you're starting to catch on." The truth hit him like cold iron. "It was you," he whispered. "Both of you. You hired someone to play her, to make me doubt myself." Theo's grin widened. "And it worked, didn't it? You saw what we wanted you to see, heard what we wanted you to hear. The villagers already think you're losing your mind. Soon, when the right evidence is planted, no court will question it." The grieving millionaire novelist who couldn't handle the death of his son. A tragic decline. "And we—" He glanced at Clara with a hunger that made Marcus's stomach turn. "We inherit everything." Marcus staggered back against the mantel, his eyes flicking to the wooden knight standing there, sword raised. Daniel's toy, a reminder of the only truth that mattered. "You monsters," he hissed. Theo's eyes hardened. "Call us what you want, but you won't be alive long enough for it to matter." The next blow came swift. A rag pressed against Marcus's face, the acrid sting of chemicals invading his lungs. He fought, clawing at Theo's arms, but Clara's cold hands pressed his shoulders down. Darkness swallowed him like a tide. When he awoke, he was bound, wrists aching from rope, mouth dry with salt. He was in a boat. The night sky stretched vast above him, the stars indifferent. Clara and Theo stood over him, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. "Quick and clean," Clara murmured. "A tragic accident. The author drowned at sea. How poetic." Theo leaned down, close enough that Marcus could see the cruelty in his grin. "Goodbye, old friend." They heaved him over the side. The ocean's cold seized him instantly, biting through his lungs. He kicked, thrashed, but the ropes dragged him down. Above, the boat drifted farther, smaller. Water roared in his ears, pressed against his chest like an iron hand. And then he saw it, a glimmer in the dark, a small, familiar shape drifting toward him. The toy knight, Daniel's knight, sword raised. His son's laughter echoed in his mind, bright, clear, as if carried from a world beyond. And there, shining faintly in the sand of the ocean floor, a key, the very same shape as the gate lock, the symbol of the mistake that had cost his son's life. Marcus lunged, lungs burning. His fingers closed around the key. In the impossible logic of dreams, the rope binding his wrists loosened, uncoiled, fell away. He kicked hard, breaking the surface with a gasp that tore his throat raw. The night air slammed into his chest like a second birth. The boat was gone. Only the waves remained, surging around him. He swam with desperate strokes toward the shore, the key still clenched in his fist, cutting into his skin like a promise. By the time he collapsed onto the sand, coughing brine, the eastern sky was bleeding pale with dawn. He lay there trembling, half dead, half reborn, staring at the key in his palm. Daniel's voice seemed to whisper through the wind, "Don't leave the gate open again, Papa." Marcus staggered to his feet. There was only one place left to go, the abandoned house where Alara had first appeared. If Theo and Clara weren't finished, he would end this himself. But what awaited him there was not deception. It was something far older, far darker. The cottage loomed against the cliff like a wound that refused to close. Marcus stumbled toward it, drenched and shivering, clutching the iron key so tightly his knuckles burned white. Dawn had risen fully now, smearing the horizon in pale gold. Yet the house seemed untouched by light, as if it belonged to a darker world. The door creaked open at his touch. Inside, the air was heavy, suffocating, as though it had been waiting for him. Shadows stretched long across the walls. He stepped forward, water dripping from his clothes onto the wooden floor. Each step felt like trespassing into a place where no living man should go. And then voices, Clara's, sharp with irritation, Theo's, low and coaxing. They were here, still alive, still certain he had drowned. "You should have tied the knots tighter," Clara hissed. "He's gone," Theo replied. "No one could survive that." Marcus's rage surged. He was about to burst into the room, to confront them with the key in his fist like a weapon, when the temperature dropped. A sudden, unnatural chill swept through the house, extinguishing the last courage in his breath. He froze. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged. Alara. Her coat clung to her like seaweed, her dark hair dripping though no water touched her. Her eyes glowed faintly, hollow yet burning, as though lit by embers of grief that had never cooled. She did not walk. She drifted, the air folding around her, the floorboards creaking under a weight that wasn't entirely of this earth. Clara gasped, stumbling back. "No, this isn't possible." Theo swore under his breath, reaching for the knife at his belt. "It's a trick. It has to be." But Marcus knew. He had always known. The woman who cooked with him, who rode beside him, who listened without judgment. She had been real once. Real enough to love, real enough to lose. And what stood before them now was not an actress, not a deception. It was her truth sharpened into vengeance. "You tried to use my name," Alara whispered, her voice like waves breaking over rocks. "You tried to turn me into a lie, but I was a woman once. A wife, a soul betrayed." Her gaze pinned Clara, who shook her head wildly. "Stay back," Clara cried. "You're not real." Alara advanced. The walls shuddered, dust falling from the beams as if the house itself acknowledged her. "I was broken by a man who should have loved me, by a woman who stole what little I had left. I threw myself into the sea because life had no mercy. But you—" Her eyes cut to Theo, glowing brighter. "You wanted to profit from another's pain. You made grief into a weapon. For that," the rest of her words dissolved into a scream. Not human, not earthly. The windows shattered inward, glass exploding like rain. Clara shrieked as shards sliced her skin. Theo lunged with the knife, but it passed through Alara as if through smoke. A moment later, the blade turned in his hand, yanked by an invisible force, and buried itself in his chest. His scream gurgled into silence. Clara fell to her knees, blood streaking her face. "Please," she begged, hands raised. "I did it for us. For me. I just wanted what was mine." Alara bent down, her face inches from Clara's, her breath like frost. "What was yours was envy, and envy always devours its master." Clara's body convulsed as though invisible hands squeezed the life from her. When it ended, she crumpled, lifeless, eyes still wide in terror. Silence followed. Only Marcus remained standing, trembling, his breath shallow. He looked at Alara, his heart breaking all over again. "Why me?" he whispered. Why did you come to me? Her gaze softened. For a moment, the vengeful fire dimmed, and he saw the woman she had once been, the one who smiled shyly over dough, who rode horses with the wind in her hair. Because you knew loss, she said, and the lost find each other. Tears blurred his vision. Will you stay? Her smile was sorrowful. No, my time is finished. But yours isn't. She reached out, her hand cold against his cheek, yet filled with a tenderness no living touch had given him in years. Live, Marcus, write the truth. And when love comes again, do not turn it away. Then she was gone, not vanishing like smoke, but dissolving into light, rising with the dawn until only warmth remained. Marcus collapsed to his knees, the key still clutched in his fist, sobbing into the silence. Theo and Clara's bodies lay still, but he did not look at them. He looked only at the empty space where she had stood. For the first time since Daniel's death, his grief did not suffocate. It breathed with him. Weeks turned into months, and the storm that had almost consumed Marcus finally passed. The authorities investigated Clara and Theo's deaths, their schemes unraveling easily once documents and correspondence surfaced. Bank records, hidden letters, even Clara's careless notes about his supposed decline. They had plotted everything to gaslight him, declare him unstable, inherit his fortune. But fate or something greater had intervened. Marcus was no murderer. He was a survivor. The newspapers circled like vultures, whispering about the millionaire novelist who had nearly drowned in grief. Some called him haunted, others a genius driven mad by tragedy. Marcus ignored them. For the first time in years, he no longer cared what the world believed. He had stared into the abyss, seen the face of his son in the water, and met a woman who was both memory and miracle. Let them call him mad. Madness had saved him. He returned to the city quietly, the cottage sold, the ocean left behind like a closed chapter. Yet he carried something back. The key. Worn, rusted, still etched with salt. He kept it in his pocket always, a reminder that guilt could not chain him forever, that he had been given another chance to live. Writing came back slowly, like blood returning to a numb limb. At first just sentences, then pages, until one day he realized he had written the beginning of something larger. Not a ghost story, not a romance, a confession in disguise, a story of a man who lost everything and found a truth darker and brighter than fiction. He knew Daniel would have wanted it that way, a different ending. One autumn afternoon, he wandered into a small bookstore tucked between two cafes. The air smelled of paper and cinnamon, warm and unhurried. He moved through the aisles absent-mindedly, fingers trailing across spines, until a voice startled him. "Excuse me, do you know if they have more of these?" He turned and froze. The woman standing before him held a book in her hands, her dark hair braided loosely over one shoulder, her eyes wide, curious, impossibly familiar. For a heartbeat, Marcus forgot how to breathe. She looked so much like Alara that the air bent around her. Yet there was no shadow in her eyes, no ghost in her skin. She was alive, real. I don't work here," he stammered, his voice rough. She smiled, a little embarrassed. "Sorry, I thought you might. You just looked like someone who knows where to find good stories." Her laugh was soft, genuine. And in that moment Marcus realized the world had given him what Alara had promised. Love, returning not as a specter, but as flesh and breath and possibility. He offered his hand. "Marcus." "Adeline," she replied. The touch was warm, grounding. Outside, the leaves rustled in a wind that carried no ghosts. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the future unfold before him. Not as a punishment, not as a sentence, but as a gift. Somewhere Daniel was smiling. Somewhere Ilara had found peace. And here, in the quiet of a bookstore, Marcus Hale began again.